The air was heavy with silence, broken only by the ticking of a clock that seemed far too loud for the small, dimly lit room. Something about the stillness suggested danger. Not the kind that comes from a sudden blow, but the slow, suffocating weight of a world where being seen in the wrong place, with the wrong book, could cost everything. A young girl bent over her papers, her breath shallow, her hands trembling just slightly as she traced lines of forbidden knowledge in the wavering light. Outside, boots scraped against the frozen cobblestones, and the echo of authority pressed close against the walls. She knew that if anyone opened the door now, the thin line she walked between safety and ruin would vanish instantly. Yet she stayed. Every letter she read, every equation she attempted to solve, was a secret act of rebellion. She was not supposed to know these things, not supposed to thirst for them, but something inside her refused to bend. The world outside demanded obedience, silence, and the narrow path assigned to her. But in this hidden corner, in the stolen hours of night, she carved out a space for possibility. Her pen scratched against paper like a blade, cutting open the sealed chamber of her future. The walls seemed closer than they had before. Were they listening? Was someone outside? Her imagination twisted every creak of wood into a threat, every gust of wind into a whisper of betrayal. Still, her eyes remained locked on the page. What she was doing was dangerous. What she dreamed of was impossible. And yet she could not stop. A shadow passed across the window, and her heart lurched. For a moment, her mind leapt to the worst. Discovery, punishment, the end of everything before it had begun. She waited, rigid, the silence unbearable, until the shadow slid away again. The danger had not yet found her. But it lingered, just beyond reach, reminding her that the path she had chosen was lined with traps. She tightened her grip on her pen, drawing closer to the candle as though the flame itself might protect her. Her father's voice returned to her memory, urging her never to let go of learning, never to forget that even in the darkest times, knowledge was a weapon no one could entirely strip away. She repeated his words in her head like a charm, steadying her resolve. Still, the weight of fear pressed down. To be a girl who wanted too much was to stand at the edge of a cliff. Every day, the ground shifted beneath her feet, but she refused to step back. If anything, she leaned forward, daring the abyss to open. The papers before her blurred for a moment as fatigue clawed at her, but she forced her eyes to remain open. What if this was her only chance? What if tomorrow the doors closed forever, and the dream dissolved into the gray life expected of her? No, she could not waste even a second. Each word she copied, each formula she traced, was a fragment of the future she had not yet dared to name. Outside, the night thickened. Snow began to fall, muffling the world, creating a fragile cocoon around the house. She listened for footsteps, but none came. The danger had retreated, at least for now, though she knew it would never vanish completely. Danger was a constant companion to those who refused to bow their heads. Her candle flickered low, threatening to die, and for an instant the room plunged into shadow. Her breath caught, the darkness feeling like a trap snapping shut. Then the flame steadied again, though weaker, and she let out the air she had been holding. Time was running out, but she could not leave the page unfinished. To stop was to betray herself, and that, she decided, would be worse than discovery. The girl bent closer, writing faster now, her fear burning into determination. The world outside could forbid her, could try to silence her, could threaten her at every turn. But here, in the narrow gap carved by her stubborn will, she was free. And though she could not yet know it, the dangerous hunger that kept her awake through these nights would one day ignite discoveries that changed everything. For now, though, she was only a girl in a dark room, risking everything for knowledge, and feeling the shadow of peril watching from just beyond the walls. The body lay broken in the street, struck down by a sudden weight of iron and wheels, and in that instant, the world she had built with him cracked open into silence. People screamed, horses reared, a carriage jolted to a halt, but she heard none of it. The air itself seemed to freeze, and all she could see was the lifeless form of the man who had been her anchor, her partner in everything, lying motionless against the hard stones. A terrible thought rose inside her. If he was gone, then the ground beneath her feet was gone too. She stood on the edge of that moment as though trapped in a nightmare that refused to end. There was no safety, no certainty, no hand to hold on to any more. The questions stormed her mind, sharp and merciless. How could it happen so suddenly? How could life, which had once felt so full, now feel like a trap closing in around her? The city around her seemed hostile now, every sound carrying the threat of finality. The days that followed stretched like an endless corridor with no exit. She wandered through them as though haunted, chased by a specter she could not escape. Every corner of their home whispered his absence. Every object carried the weight of what had been torn away. She felt as though she were living in a house built on quicksand, one step away from being swallowed whole. And yet, even in her despair, something pulled at her. A voice, not his this time, but her own, quiet and insistent. It told her that if she let the darkness take her, everything they had fought for together would be lost. The dangerous path they had begun to carve out was unfinished, and the thought of leaving it incomplete was unbearable. Still, doubt gnawed at her. She had no one beside her now, no shield against the world's harsh gaze. To continue meant standing alone, and standing alone meant exposing herself to dangers she had always managed to face with him at her side. Would they accept her? Would they even allow her to continue? Or would they crush her under the weight of tradition and prejudice? The questions remained unanswered, but she knew hesitation was a luxury she could not afford. The night she returned to the work they had begun was filled with the same heavy silence that had once threatened to suffocate her as a girl. She walked into the dim laboratory where their discoveries had been born. The air was thick with the memory of him, the faint scent of chemicals, the scattered notes, the unfinished experiments that still waited. Her hands trembled as she touched the pages, as though expecting them to burn her. Danger lingered here too, though not the kind that came from the outside world. This was the danger of carrying forward alone, of shouldering a burden that could break her. Her eyes scanned the equations, the data, the fragments of work they had pieced together with so much labor. The shadows seemed to crowd closer, as if to ask whether she was strong enough to continue. She did not answer, not yet. Instead, she turned to the bench, lit the flame, and forced her hands to steady. Each motion was a defiance, each decision a step deeper into the unknown. The work consumed her, dragging her out of her grief, though never entirely releasing its grip. The dangers multiplied: physical exhaustion, the invisible toll on her body, the scrutiny of a world that doubted her, but she pressed forward. It was as though danger itself had become her companion, a reminder that the path she followed was never meant to be safe. And yet, she could feel his presence in the silence, not as a ghost to haunt her, but as a challenge. To falter now would mean letting everything fall into ruin. To move forward meant stepping into a place no one like her had ever stood before. Both choices were perilous, but only one held meaning. She chose. The nights grew longer, her body weaker, but her will sharpened into steel. The danger that had once seemed overwhelming became the measure of her strength. She walked alone now, but she walked with purpose, her every step carving out the impossible. The mysterious and treacherous path ahead remained cloaked in shadow, its outcome uncertain, its cost unimaginable. But still, she did not stop. The letter burned in her hands long before she dared to open it. Its arrival had been sudden, delivered without warning, its seal heavy with authority and the weight of judgment. For days she had worked in silence, surrounded by her notes, her body aching from exhaustion, her mind balanced precariously between brilliance and collapse, and now this. A summons, or perhaps a condemnation. She could not know yet, but she felt the danger coiled within every fold of the paper. Her chest tightened as she imagined what words might lie inside. Were they preparing to strip her of the very ground she stood on? To call her unworthy, an outsider, a fraud? Whispers had already filled the halls she walked through, the venom of envy twisting into rumors. She had felt their eyes upon her, heard their voices sharpen when they thought she could not hear. Now, in her hands, perhaps was the proof of what they intended all along, to cast her out. She placed the letter down on the table and stepped back, as though it might ignite the moment she touched it again. Around her, the laboratory was quiet, too quiet, the silence heavy with unfinished experiments. The faint glow of instruments and the lingering scent of her work seemed to press against her, urging her to resist fear, to remember why she had begun. But the letter remained, waiting like a trap that could not be avoided. She thought of leaving it sealed, of pretending she had never seen it. But that, too, was a kind of surrender. And surrender had never been her way. Slowly, she broke the seal, her fingers trembling against the weight of possibility. The words swam before her, sharp, accusatory, demanding. They questioned her right to stand among those who called themselves guardians of knowledge. They pointed to her origins, her gender, her defiance of the boundaries they insisted upon. They spoke of scandal, of impropriety, of dangers not just to her reputation but to the very work she had sacrificed her life to pursue. Her vision blurred for a moment, not from tears but from the sheer force of rage and fear colliding inside her. The room seemed to shrink around her, the walls leaning in, the shadows deepening. Every sentence of that letter was a weapon, designed to wound, to weaken, to drive her into silence. But silence was the one thing she could not accept. She folded the letter carefully, placed it back on the table, and sat down with a steadiness that did not match the storm inside her. Her hands clenched against the wood, her breath sharp. Danger surrounded her on every side now. Danger not of laboratories or chemicals, but of people, of power, of voices that could destroy her with a single word. The mystery was not whether they would attack, she already knew they would, but how much she could endure before the weight broke her. Night fell without her noticing, shadows creeping over her papers, the flame of the lamp flickering low. She remained where she was, motionless, the letter still before her. Every part of her body screamed with fatigue, but she refused to leave the table. To leave would mean to let the letter win, to let their words pierce deeper than they already had. So she stayed, as if her stillness could keep the walls from closing in. Her mind replayed every accusation, every rumor that had already been whispered in the dark. She remembered the glances in the lecture halls, the subtle sneers, the outright hostility that never seemed to fade. She remembered the sudden coldness of colleagues who once shook her hand with admiration. And now, all of it had hardened into this, a document that demanded her submission, her silence, her disappearance. But instead of shrinking back, she felt something rising in her chest. Not peace, not comfort, but a defiance that burned hotter than fear. If they wanted her to vanish, she would make herself impossible to erase. If they demanded her silence, she would answer with discoveries so loud the world could not ignore them. Still, she did not move from the table. The danger was not over, and the shadows of her enemies lingered just outside her door. Every step forward would be watched, every action scrutinized, every mistake magnified until it became a weapon against her. The world had placed her in a cage made of suspicion and envy, and now she had to decide how to break free without destroying herself in the process. The letter lay where she had left it, but its weight did not lessen. It was no longer just paper, it was the embodiment of the peril that surrounded her, the reminder that even as she stood on the edge of greatness, the ground beneath her was unstable, fragile, and treacherous. She leaned back at last, her eyes burning from hours of strain, and stared into the flickering light. No answers came, no reassurance, only the certainty that the road ahead was darker than ever. And yet she knew, with a clarity that was sharper than fear, that she would walk it anyway. The glass shattered in her hands, and for a heartbeat she thought it was her own body breaking. The liquid spread across the table, glowing faintly in the dim light, a dangerous brightness that seemed almost alive. She froze, every muscle locked, as though even a breath could ignite disaster. Her skin burned where a drop had touched, sharp and cold at once, searing into her memory the reminder that the work she pursued carried dangers far more silent than any rumor or accusation. For a moment, the room felt like a trap. The walls, the instruments, the papers, all of them leaned in, pressing down with an invisible weight. She had been warned. The whispers of illness, the sudden fatigue, the trembling of her hands, signs she had chosen to ignore. But now the danger was no longer hidden in numbers or theories. It was here, on her skin, creeping closer with every second she hesitated. Her breath came sharp, her heartbeat uneven. She did not move. She could not move. The question clawed at her, had she gone too far? The silence around her offered nothing, no answer, no relief, only the steady pulse of danger that filled the air like poison. Her eyes flicked toward the door, half expecting someone to burst through, to catch her in this moment of weakness, to see her not as a pioneer but as a fool undone by her own obsession. No one came. The world outside remained silent, indifferent to the peril that now spread invisibly across the room. She was alone, more alone than ever, and the responsibility of that loneliness pressed harder than the fear itself. The glass on the floor glinted like broken promises. She thought of him again, the one who had once stood at her side, who had steadied her hands, who had taken the burden with her. He was gone, and now the weight was hers alone to bear. If she faltered now, if she yielded to fear, then everything they had begun would crumble into nothing. But if she pressed forward, the danger would only deepen, each step pulling her closer to a place from which there might be no return. Her hands trembled as she reached for a cloth, her body screaming at her to stop, to flee, to abandon the work that had already consumed so much of her strength. But she forced herself forward, wiping carefully, each movement deliberate, controlled, as though she were binding a wound that would never truly heal. Even when the surface was clean, the danger did not leave. It lingered, invisible, impossible to measure, pressing into her bones, reminding her that her enemy was not only outside, not only in the letters and the voices that sought to destroy her, but inside the very work she loved. The brilliance that gave her purpose was the same force that threatened to erase her. She leaned against the table, her breath ragged, her vision swimming with exhaustion. For a moment, the thought crept in, what if they were right? What if this was madness, chasing something that offered nothing but pain, sacrifice, and ruin? What if the discovery she sought was not salvation but destruction? The question hovered like a shadow, unanswered, demanding, relentless. And yet, even in that moment of fear, her resolve flared. Danger had always been her companion. In the secret classrooms of her youth, in the cold rooms of Paris where hunger gnawed at her, in the grief that tore her life in half. Every step had been carved against resistance, every breath a defiance of the limits imposed upon her. Why should this be any different? She straightened slowly, her body still weak, her heart still racing, but her mind sharp again. The broken glass remained on the floor, a warning she could not ignore, but she stepped past it, turning her focus once more to the work that demanded her. The shadows deepened around her, the flame of the lamp flickering as though it too struggled against the weight of the night. She did not know how much longer her body could endure. She did not know whether the danger she carried within her would one day consume her completely. But she knew this, the path she walked had no return, and she would not, could not, turn back now. The silence of the room closed in again, heavy, suffocating, alive with questions that offered no answers. And still she worked. The war had swallowed the city whole, and she was driving straight into its mouth. The road stretched before her like a wound torn through the land. The fields around her churned into mud and ash. The little machine rattled under her hands, fragile against the thunder of distant guns. Each explosion shook the horizon, and with every blast she wondered if the next would find her, tear apart the fragile walls of her vehicle, and end everything in a moment of fire and silence. The soldiers she passed stared at her with disbelief, some with suspicion, others with desperate hope. She carried no weapon, no shield, only the strange contraptions she had built with her own hands. They looked like boxes of secrets, humming faintly, filled with wires and lenses, machines that could peer inside the body and reveal what the eyes could not see. She knew they would change the fate of countless men, yet as she moved closer to the front, she felt the danger grow sharper, as though even knowledge itself was at risk of being torn apart by the chaos of war. Her heart pounded as she guided the machine over rough ground, the sound of artillery pressing closer. The fear was real, fear of capture, of being mistaken for a spy, of being erased in the smoke and ruin, but she kept moving. The mission was simple in words, impossible in reality: to bring light into the darkness, to see the unseen, to give wounded men a chance where there had been none. The closer she drew to the trenches, the more the air thickened, heavy with smoke and the iron taste of blood. Every face she saw bore the same question. Who was she to appear here, in this place where even the earth seemed cursed? They did not ask it aloud, but she felt it, pressing into her as heavily as the war itself. Was she savior or intruder? Could they trust her, or would she betray them in some unknowable way? The machine jolted to a stop at the edge of a shattered farmhouse. The soldiers helped her unload, their hands uncertain, their eyes flicking toward the horizon where fire still bloomed. She worked quickly, forcing her body to ignore its own weakness, her fingers trembling not only from exhaustion but from the knowledge that time itself was against them. A man lay on the ground, his breath shallow, his blood dark against the mud. They brought him to her, and all eyes turned to see whether her strange device would reveal the truth. She positioned the plates, adjusted the coils, prayed the wires would hold. The hum filled the air, sharp and insistent, cutting through the chaos like a whisper of something beyond human. The shadows flickered across the image, uncertain at first, then forming into clarity. There it was, the splintered bone, the fragment lodged deep within the flesh, the secret wound no one else could see. Gasps rippled around her. The danger of disbelief shifted into something else, something heavier, the weight of expectation. They would demand more now, always more. And with every life she saved, she bound herself tighter to the peril of failure. Night fell quickly, the battlefield swallowed by darkness. She sat alone beside her machine, its glow faint against the abyss. The soldiers slept in fragments, their rest broken by the constant threat of shellfire. She remained awake, her mind restless, her body aching from days without pause. The danger was not only from the guns now. It was inside her too, in the marrow of her bones, in the fatigue that no sleep seemed able to cure. She wondered, not for the first time, how long she could continue. How many nights like this could a single body endure? How many wounds could she watch without breaking? And yet the thought of stopping was more unbearable than the fear of collapse. To stop would mean abandoning the very reason she had come here, the reason she had risked everything to step into the heart of war. The guns roared again in the distance, and the ground trembled. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sound pass through her, reminding herself that fear was not the end but the beginning. Every danger she had faced until now had demanded the same choice, retreat or press forward. And each time she had chosen to move ahead, no matter the cost. Now, on the edge of this battlefield, she felt the same decision pressing against her. The danger was greater than ever, the risk almost unbearable, but the path behind her was gone. There was no going back. Only forward, into the unknown, into the fire, into the mystery that waited beyond the next horizon. The conclusion rose in her mind like a truth she had always known but never spoken, that her life would never be safe, never be free of danger. Knowledge was peril, discovery was peril, even compassion was peril when carried into a world determined to destroy itself. She could not change that truth. She could only embrace it, as she always had, and let it shape her into something unbreakable. She opened her eyes again, the glow of the machine steady in the night, and felt the danger settle into her bones, not as a threat, but as a companion. The war raged on. She stayed at her post. And though the answers to the questions that haunted her remained hidden in the shadows, she knew with absolute certainty that she would not stop. Her blood itself had turned against her. At first, it was only fatigue, the kind that weighed on her limbs like chains after long days in the laboratory. Then came the fevers, the pallor that no rest could fix, the sharp ache in her bones that spread like a silent enemy crawling beneath her skin. She told no one at first. She pushed through it, as she always had, dismissing the weakness as an inconvenience. But soon the truth became undeniable. The very force she had wrestled into discovery was seeping into her, unseen, unstoppable, changing her from within. She stood in her laboratory, surrounded by the same instruments that had once filled her with exhilaration. Now they loomed like threats, whispering of consequences she had long ignored. The glowing vials, the shimmering dust, the notebooks filled with proof of her triumphs. All of it seemed suddenly dangerous, treacherous, as though waiting for the right moment to betray her. She knew the dangers, of course. She had known them from the beginning, even when no one else believed. But knowing was not the same as feeling the poison take root in her flesh. The world outside called her a pioneer, a genius, a woman who had conquered the impossible. Inside these walls, she was a prisoner of her own discoveries. She asked herself in the silence of the night, had she gone too far? Had she crossed a threshold from which there could be no return? The questions pressed against her with a weight she could not shake. She kept working anyway. Every movement was slower now, every note written with hands that trembled just enough to betray her. She leaned on the table more often, her breath short, her eyes heavy, but she forced herself forward. To stop would mean to admit that the danger had already won. And she had never been one to yield. But the whispers grew louder. Not just the ones in her mind, but in the world around her. Colleagues noticed her failing strength, students saw her stumble, assistants exchanged worried glances behind her back. She felt their eyes on her, questioning whether she could endure, whether the woman who had once seemed indestructible was now breaking apart. She wanted to shout that they were wrong, that she was still herself, that she still held power over the unknown, but her voice stayed silent, because some part of her feared they might be right. One evening, as she bent over the table, the room spun, and she collapsed into the chair, her head heavy, her vision blurred. The silence that followed was suffocating. She pressed her hand to her chest, feeling her heart flutter like a trapped bird, and wondered if this was the moment it would end. The thought of death did not frighten her, not the way others might expect. What terrified her was the possibility of leaving the work unfinished, of letting the world take her discoveries and twist them without her, of vanishing before she had secured the legacy she had fought for with every breath. She sat there for hours, unmoving, until the trembling subsided. Then she rose again, weaker than before, but resolute. Danger was everywhere now. Inside her body, inside her mind, in the very air of the laboratory, but she had lived her entire life alongside danger. It had been her shadow since childhood, her constant adversary and her only companion. She knew how to carry it. The days grew shorter, her strength thinner, but her will sharpened. She pushed her students harder, poured herself into lectures, demanded of herself the same impossible standard she always had. Each step was agony, but each step also affirmed her choice, that she would not surrender, not now, not until the last of her strength was gone. And yet, even as she pressed forward, she felt the conclusion approaching. Not the end of her work, not yet, but the end of her own body's ability to withstand the weight of it. The danger had become permanent, fused into her blood, inseparable from her life. She could not undo what had been done, could not outrun what she had invited in. The only choice left was how to face it. She stood before her students one last time, her voice thin but steady, her eyes alight with the same fire that had carried her through hunger, through grief, through scorn, through war. They listened in silence, aware that they were watching not only a teacher but a woman who had staked her entire existence on the pursuit of knowledge, a woman who bore the scars of her devotion in her very flesh. When she finished, the silence lingered. She turned from them, her body frail, her steps uncertain, but her resolve unbroken. The conclusion was clear: her own life would fade, her strength would vanish, but the work would remain. The danger she had carried would outlive her, echoing through generations, both as a gift and as a warning. She walked away from the lecture hall into the night, the air cool against her fevered skin. The city around her pulsed with life, unaware of the weight she carried within. She knew her time was short. She knew the danger could not be escaped. But she also knew this: the world would remember. And in that knowledge, she found the strength to keep going, even as her body betrayed her, even as the shadows deepened. She did not look back. The coffin was sealed before the questions could be. She had been carried away, her body too fragile to resist, her blood poisoned by the very brilliance she had pursued. The world around her spoke in reverence, in tribute, in polished phrases that disguised the unease beneath them. But even as they honored her, a shadow lingered. Had the price been too high? Had she been consumed by the very fire she had lit for others to follow? No one dared to answer aloud, yet the silence pressed heavier than words. The mystery did not end with her. It deepened. The laboratory still held traces of her, invisible dangers clinging to the papers she had written, to the instruments she had touched. Those who came after her approached with caution, fearful of the legacy they inherited, not only of knowledge but of risk. It was as if she had left behind both a gift and a curse, and no one could yet decide which weighed more. And I cannot help but think, was this always the destiny she carried from the moment she bent over forbidden books in Warsaw, her candle flickering against the dark? Was the danger not simply around her but within her path from the beginning, woven into the fabric of her determination? Each choice seemed, in hindsight, a step toward this conclusion, toward a life burned at both ends by brilliance and by sacrifice. The tension lies not in her death, but in what it leaves unresolved. The discoveries she made reshaped the world, yet they also opened doors that led into terrifying corridors. Radiation became both healer and destroyer, salvation and weapon. She had dreamed of knowledge for its own sake, of light piercing through ignorance, but the world is never so pure. Others would seize what she uncovered and bend it into new forms of danger. Could she have foreseen it? Would she have turned back if she had known? The questions claw at me, but they find no answers. What lingers most is not her frailty, nor even her triumphs, but her defiance. She lived with danger as if it were her shadow, never fleeing, never pretending it wasn't there. She faced the scorn of those who doubted her, the grief of loss, the silent poison of her work, and still she chose to move forward. Perhaps that is the true mystery. Not why she endured so much, but how she never allowed fear to bend her will. And yet I wonder if there is a warning hidden in her silence. She did not retreat, but she also did not shield herself. The brilliance that drove her was also the blindness that doomed her. Her life seems to tell us that knowledge is never innocent, that to seek it is to bargain with dangers unseen, dangers that may not reveal their cost until too late. She accepted that bargain fully, perhaps too fully, and the world gained because of it, but she was the one who paid. Still, I cannot call it a tragedy. To do so would strip her of the very agency she fought for. She was not a victim, though danger followed her always. She was a force, relentless, unyielding, and her end does not erase her victories. If anything, it makes them sharper, more alive, because they came not from safety but from peril. She did not wait for permission, she did not shrink before fear, and she never stopped, even as her body failed. The tension remains, unresolved, because her story is unfinished. Not in her life, that is already sealed, but in ours. We carry the consequences of her choices, we wield the power she unearthed, we live in a world shaped by her defiance. The danger she embraced did not vanish with her, it became ours to confront. And perhaps that is the greatest thought I leave this chapter with, that her legacy is not only the brilliance of discovery but the weight of responsibility. She showed what it meant to walk into danger for the sake of knowledge, but she also left us with the haunting truth that knowledge itself is never without cost. The coffin was sealed, yes. But the questions she left behind remain wide open, burning like the very elements she gave her life to reveal.